180,000 to 200,000 talents, between $300 and $500 billion in today's money. That's what Alexander the Great captured from the Persian Empire in just 11 years. To move just the Persepolis Hall alone required 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels. The treasure train stretched 70 miles long. At 13 miles per day, the front of the convoy reached its destination 5 days before the rear even departed. This wasn't conquest. This was the largest robbery in ancient history. And here's what they don't tell you. Alexander started his campaign nearly bankrupt. 1,460 talents in debt. He gambled everything on conquering the richest empire the world had ever seen. And when he won, the sudden influx of wealth didn't make him secure. It nearly bankrupted him again. If you think modern wars are expensive, wait until you see what it actually cost to conquer the known world. Welcome to Past Chronicles, where history, economics, and power collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Let's set the stage. The year is 336 BCE. Philip II of Macedon has just been assassinated. His 20-year-old son, Alexander, inherits a kingdom on the edge of bankruptcy and an army preparing to invade the Persian Empire. Philip had spent decades building the most effective military machine in the ancient world, the Macedonian phalanx, the companion cavalry, professional siege engineers, but all that military power came at a cost. When Alexander took the throne, the royal treasury was nearly empty. He had inherited ambition and debt in equal measure. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Alexander began his reign with only 70 talents in the treasury. He borrowed 800 talents more to finance the initial stages of his campaign. That's 1,460 talents of debt before a single battle. This isn't Hollywood myth. This is documented financial reality. The numbers survive in ancient sources, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but real. And they tell a story very different from the one you learned in school. Most people think Alexander conquered Persia for glory, for revenge, because the Persians had invaded Greece a century and a half earlier. That's part of it. But there's a simpler explanation. Persia was rich, unimaginably rich. The Achaemenid kings had been accumulating gold and silver for 2 centuries. Cyrus the Great founded the empire in 550 BCE. Darius I expanded it. Xerxes tried and failed to conquer Greece. And for 200 years they stockpiled treasure in royal treasuries across their vast empire. By 334 BCE, when Alexander crossed into Asia, those treasuries held the accumulated wealth of the richest empire in history. Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital where the kings displayed their power in architectural splendor. Alexander wasn't just conquering territory, he was robbing the world's largest bank. But to understand how much wealth he actually captured and what he did with it, we need to follow the silver and the gold. Literally, tons of it. Alexander's treasure hunt began with military victories. The Battle of Chronicles in 334 BCE. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. Each victory brought plunder, captured baggage trains, ransoms for Persian nobles, 4,000 talents from Issus alone. But the real prize came after the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Darius III fled, his army collapsed, and the road to the Persian heartland lay open. First, Alexander reached Babylon. The city surrendered without a fight. He captured its treasury and proclaimed himself king of Asia. Then Susa, the administrative capital, 50,000 talents in gold. That's roughly $75 billion in modern purchasing power. But Persepolis was different. Persepolis wasn't just rich. It was symbolic. According to the World History Encyclopedia, Alexander described Persepolis to the Macedonians as their worst enemy among the cities of Asia, and he gave it over to the soldiers to plunder. Here much silver was carried off, and no little gold. Alexander went up to the citadel and took possession of the treasures stored there. They were full of gold and silver, with the accumulation of revenue from Cyrus, the first king of the Persians, down to that time. The accumulation from Cyrus down to that time. 2 centuries of Persian imperial wealth, all in one place. The numbers from Persepolis are staggering. Ancient sources disagree on the exact figures. Some say 100,000 talents, others say 120,000. But historians agree it was the single largest capture of precious metals in ancient warfare. Frank L. Holt, Professor Emeritus at the University of Houston, and author of the definitive study on Alexander's wealth, cross-referenced multiple ancient accounts. His estimate, 120,000 talents from Persepolis alone. That's 3,100 metric tons of gold and silver, measured in silver equivalent. 120,000 talents is approximately $280 billion in today's purchasing power. From one city, in 1 month. To transport it, Alexander's army needed an enormous convoy. Ancient sources record 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels. Holt calculated that such a train would stretch approximately 70 miles from front to back, traveling at 13 to 15 miles per day. The standard pace for loaded pack animals. The lead elements would arrive at their destination nearly a week before the rearguard even departed Persepolis. Think about the logistics. 15,000 animals, 70 miles of treasure, every animal guarded, every chest accounted for. Moving through hostile territory. This wasn't just military conquest. This was the ancient world's most ambitious transportation project. And then Alexander burned it. After his troops looted the city for days after he'd secured every last talent from the treasury, Alexander set fire to the great palace of Xerxes, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the architectural masterpiece that had taken generations to build. Ancient sources disagree about why. Was it deliberate revenge for Persian invasions of Greece 150 years earlier? Was it a drunken accident, as some accounts claim? Or was it calculated symbolism, the end of Persian imperial power, marked by fire? The motivation matters less than the economics. Persepolis wasn't just a military target. It was the Persian Empire's Fort Knox. And Alexander emptied it before he destroyed it. He took 200 years of accumulated imperial wealth and turned it into military funding. The Persian Empire had been history's richest state. In one campaign season, Alexander became history's richest man. But here's the problem. Wealth and solvency are not the same thing. You can control billions and still run out of money. Alexander was about to learn that lesson the hard way. From 334 to 330 BC, just 4 years of campaigning, Alexander captured treasure from across the Persian Empire. Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, Persepolis, smaller cities and satrapies. Holt's research, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. Represents the most comprehensive modern analysis of Alexander's wealth, by cross-referencing accounts from Plutarch, Arrian, Curtius, Diodorus, and Justin. Holt arrived at a plausible range, between 180,000 and 200,000 talents total. That doesn't include art, jewels, exotic animals, enslaved people, or other forms of non-monetary wealth. Just precious metals, gold and silver, measured by weight. In modern units, approximately 5,200 metric tons of precious metals. In modern purchasing power, between $300 and $500 billion, depending on which methodology you use to calculate ancient wealth. To put that in perspective, the entire Greek world's annual economic output was probably around 15,000 to 20,000 talents. Alexander captured 10 times Greece's annual GDP in precious metals alone. He had pulled off the greatest heist in ancient history. Now came the hard part: spending it. Here's what most people miss about Alexander's conquest. Capturing wealth and managing wealth are completely different skills. Alexander was brilliant at the first, terrible at the second. Modern militaries have logistics corps, finance officers, supply chains with redundancy built in. Alexander had Harpalus's childhood friend, whom he appointed imperial treasurer, and Harpalus, as we'll see, was either incompetent or corrupt, probably both. But even before we get to embezzlement, there's a simpler pattern. Alexander spent money faster than he could count it. His army wages alone ran between 7,000 and 8,000 talents per year, approximately $200 million annually in modern terms. And that's just basic pay, not bonuses or rewards. After major victories, Alexander distributed massive bonuses. 13,000 talents to soldiers after capturing Ecbatana, over $300 million in a single payout. His closest companions received even more lavish gifts. Sound familiar? It should. Alexander's inner circle, his companion cavalry, his generals, his heteroi received talents by the thousands. Gold crowns, estates, administrative positions with revenue streams. They became fantastically wealthy from conquest. Meanwhile, the average Macedonian infantryman earned perhaps 600 drachmas per year, about 1/10 of a talent. Yes, he might receive bonuses, but the wealth concentration at the top was extreme. Today, defense contractors and military suppliers generate billions from war. CEOs of arms manufacturers earn millions. The infantry grunt earns $40,000. Different technology, same pattern. War enriches those who control the system more than those who fight it. But military pay was only part of Alexander's expenses. He was building an empire, not just conquering territory. And empires are expensive. He founded over 20 cities, Alexandria in Egypt being the most famous. Each city required initial construction funding, administrative setup, garrison troops. Thousands of colonists had to be settled. Infrastructure had to be built. Religious expenses ran high. Alexander made lavish sacrifices to the gods after every victory. He funded festivals, games, theatrical performances. When his close friend Hephaestion died in 324 BCE, Alexander spent over 10,000 talents on the funeral. That's nearly $250 million on a single burial ceremony. Then there were bribes, political payoffs, diplomatic gifts. When he needed cooperation from Athens, he sent them money. When he needed to placate restive provinces, he distributed gold. Medical services for his enormous army cost 32 million drachmas over the 13-year campaign, roughly $91 million in modern terms. Just for doctors and medicine. Add it all up: army wages, city founding, religious ceremonies, diplomatic payments, medical costs, bonuses, rewards, bribes. The money flowed out as fast as it came in. By 324 BCE, when Alexander returned to Susa from his disastrous march through the Gedrosian desert, he discovered something shocking. His soldiers were broke. Despite capturing hundreds of billions in treasure, the Macedonian army had accumulated massive personal debt. At Susa in 324 BCE, Alexander discovered that his veterans owed at least 9,870 talents, collectively roughly $240 million in modern terms. These were men who had marched from Macedonia to India, men who had fought in dozens of battles, men who, theoretically, had shared in the greatest plunder in history. How does an army that captures $500 billion end up in debt? The answer is both simple and devastating. Costs in the field exceeded income. Soldiers spent money on food, gear, women, drink. They sent money home. They lost possessions in battles and deserts. They borrowed from each other at interest. And unlike Alexander, who could simply confiscate more Persian gold, they had no additional source of income once the conquests slowed. Alexander paid off their debts. He had to. The alternative was mutiny. But the fact that he needed to reveals something uncomfortable. Even the greatest windfall in history couldn't sustain the economic drain of constant warfare. Sound familiar? American soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan with debt. Veterans struggling financially despite serving in wars that enriched defense contractors. Same pattern. 23 centuries apart. And here's another pattern people miss. You can't spend precious metals if you can't transport them. Alexander's army carried wealth in the form of coins, bullion, and captured art. All of it required pack animals, wagons, guards. During the march through Bactria in 329 BCE, Alexander ordered his army to burn excess baggage to speed up movement. Soldiers had to abandon personal loot. Years of accumulated plunder gone. The Gedrosian desert crossing in 325 BCE was worse. Alexander lost thousands of soldiers and thousands more animals. Any wealth those men carried died with them. Silver coins scattered in the sand, gold ornaments buried under corpses. The famous 70-mile treasure train from Persepolis that required 15,000 animals, thousands of handlers, enormous quantities of food and water, and months to reach Ecbatana. Moving wealth costs money. Protecting it costs money. Storing it costs money. The Persians understood this. They kept their treasure stationary in fortified palace treasuries. They didn't try to move it around. Alexander, constantly campaigning, had to transport his wealth everywhere. The logistical costs ate into his profits. Modern militaries face the same problem. Moving equipment costs billions. Fuel for transport, security for convoys, maintenance for vehicles. The US military spends more moving gear than many countries spend on their entire defense budget. So how did Alexander manage to capture $500 billion and still have financial problems? The trick is simple. Wealth is not the same as capital. You can own billions in assets and still run out of operating capital. Alexander captured enormous quantities of precious metals, but he couldn't spend all of it immediately. Much of it had to remain in treasuries as reserves. Security deposits, insurance against disaster. The wealth he could spend went out faster than it came in. 8,000 talents per year on wages. Thousands more on city founding, religious ceremonies, diplomatic gifts, personal rewards, the administrative costs of running an empire from India to Egypt. And here's the part that made it worse. Corruption. According to Frank L. Holt's research published by Oxford University Press. At Susa in 324, Alexander's soldiers were at least 9,870 talents in debt. Another indication of Alexander's lack of interest in finances was letting his dishonest royal treasurer, Harpalus, run amok in Babylon, and then away to Athens when Alexander inconveniently returned from India. Harpalus, Alexander's childhood friend, appointed imperial treasurer in 330 BCE, left in charge of the central treasuries while Alexander campaigned in India. And Harpalus stole everything he could get his hands on. For Harpalus and other corrupt administrators, Alexander's conquests were a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Harpalus embezzled at least 5,000 talents, over $100 million. He spent lavishly on courtesans, built monuments to his mistresses, lived like a king himself. When Alexander returned from India, Harpalus fled to Athens with 6,000 mercenaries and his stolen fortune. For ordinary soldiers, the system meant delayed pay, confiscated loot, and debt. The wealth they'd fought to capture enriched their commanders and corrupt officials. The men who did the actual fighting ended up broke. Same pattern as every major war. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The contractors get rich. The grunts get PTSD and debt. But Harpalus wasn't the only problem. Alexander's entire financial administration was dysfunctional. His replacement treasurers, Antimenes and Cleomenes, were barely better. Antimenes profited from supplying travelers on imperial roads. Cleomenes, appointed to govern Egypt, set himself up to profit from grain exports. When famine struck the Mediterranean, Cleomenes manipulated prices and made a fortune. Alexander apparently didn't care. As long as the money kept flowing to his campaigns, he ignored or tolerated corruption. Managing the managers was not a priority. He was a warrior king, not an accountant. This created a culture of waste, extortion, and embezzlement throughout his empire. Local administrators saw that the top was corrupt, so they became corrupt too. Governors extorted their provinces. Tax collectors skimmed revenue. Military suppliers overcharged. The treasure of Persia, 200 years of accumulated wealth, was being looted not just by Alexander, but by everyone in his administration who could get their hands on it. And here's the kicker: Alexander knew it was happening. He executed several corrupt officials when he returned from India, but the system was rotten. Killing a few administrators didn't fix the structural problem. You can't manage an empire the size of Alexander's with the financial oversight of a tribal kingdom. You need bureaucracy, records, audits, accountability. The Persians had that. Alexander destroyed it and replaced it with chaos. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, the economic model was clearly unsustainable. He had captured perhaps 200,000 talents total. But he'd also spent an enormous amount. Holt estimates Alexander's total expenses at well over 150,000 talents over 13 years, roughly $375 billion. That left reserves, yes, but not as much as you'd think. And Alexander was planning new campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, possibly expeditions west to Carthage and Rome. Each campaign would cost thousands more talents. The Persian treasure wasn't infinite, and Alexander had no systematic way to generate new revenue comparable to what he'd captured. The Persian Empire's annual tax revenues had been around 15,000 talents. Alexander's expenses ran 8,000 talents just on military wages. Add administrative costs, and he was spending more than the empire generated. This is the fatal flaw of conquest economies. The initial plunder is enormous, but you can't sustain an empire on plunder alone. Eventually, you need functioning tax systems, productive economies, trade networks. The Persians understood this. Alexander didn't care. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at age 33. Had he lived, his empire would have faced a financial crisis within a decade. The treasure would have run out. And then what? We'll never know. But history is full of empires that collapsed not from military defeat, but from bankruptcy. What makes this dangerous today is that modern militaries follow the exact same pattern. War generates enormous expenses that governments struggle to sustain. The United States spent over $8 trillion on wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and related operations from 2001 to 2022. $8 trillion. And what did it capture? Iraqi oil revenues? Afghan mineral deposits? No. Modern conquest doesn't seize enemy treasuries. It seizes nothing. Alexander at least got 500 billion in loot. Modern wars cost trillions and generate zero economic return. The money comes from taxpayers and debt. It goes to contractors, weapons manufacturers, logistics companies. The pattern is the same: war enriches elites but without even the fig leaf of captured enemy wealth. Defense contractors made hundreds of billions from Iraq and Afghanistan. Lockheed, Martin, Raytheon, Halliburton, Blackwater, they got their treasure. American soldiers got debt, PTSD, and inadequate veteran benefits. Over 200,000 veterans are homeless. Over 1 million have disability claims. CEOs of defense companies earn tens of millions annually. Lockheed Martin's CEO made over $20 million in 2022. That's while manufacturing weapons for wars that cost $8 trillion of public money. Meanwhile, a U.S. Army private earns about $25,000 per year. An infantry sergeant with 10 years service makes $50,000. Same economic structure as Alexander's army. The people who control the system get wealthy. The people who fight get modest pay and bear the costs. Let's run the numbers. Alexander's 13-year campaign cost approximately 150,000 to 180,000 talents. In modern purchasing power, somewhere between $375 and $450 billion. The Iraq War alone cost the United States $2 trillion over 9 years. Afghanistan, another $2 trillion over 20 years. That's $4 trillion for 2 wars that produced no territorial gains, no captured treasuries, no economic benefit. Alexander at least conquered territory. He gained tax revenue from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. His campaigns, however wasteful, captured more wealth than they cost, at least initially. Modern wars are pure economic loss. The costs are socialized. Taxpayers foot the bill. The profits are privatized. Contractors and suppliers keep the money. There's no Persian treasury to raid at the end. Just debt. The pattern Alexander pioneered, conquest, enriches commanders and suppliers more than soldiers, has evolved into something even more exploitative. Now, the conquests don't even pay for themselves. But the defense industry still profits. The U.S. defense budget for 2024 is over $900 billion. That's more per year than Alexander spent in his entire career of conquest. Every single year, with no captured enemy treasure to offset it. That's not empire building. That's just spending. And future generations will pay the bill. And here's what's happening right now. As you watch this, global military spending hit $2.4 trillion in 2023. That's not a war total. That's annual spending. Every year, by all countries combined, the United States accounts for almost 40% of that, over $900 billion annually. China spends about $300 billion. Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, all spending hundreds of billions. For what Alexander conquered from Greece to India, he captured $500 billion in treasure. Modern militaries spend $2.4 trillion per year and conquer nothing. They maintain bases, conduct exercises, fight insurgencies, project power. The economic return is zero. Or negative, when you factor in opportunity costs. $2.4 trillion could fund global healthcare, education, infrastructure. Instead, it funds weapons that sit in warehouses, ships that patrol empty oceans, and jets that fly training missions. The defense industry calls it security. Economists call it deadweight loss spending that produces no economic value. Alexander's conquests at least transferred wealth from Persia to Macedonia. Modern military spending just burns money. But the contractors still get paid. The CEOs still get rich. The shareholders still collect dividends. And soldiers still end up with debt and trauma. Alexander's pattern perfected. Privatize the profits, socialize the costs, repeat forever. So what should you take from this? First, understand that capturing wealth and managing wealth are completely different skills. Alexander was perhaps history's greatest military commander. But he was a terrible financial manager. He captured $500 billion and still faced financial crises. His army ended up in debt. His treasurers embezzled millions. He spent faster than he plundered. The lesson: even unlimited resources can be mismanaged into insolvency. Wealth requires governance, not just acquisition. Second, war economics always follow the same pattern. Elites capture most of the gains. Common soldiers bear most of the costs. This was true in Alexander's army. It was true in every imperial conquest since. It's true in modern defense spending. The people who control the system, commanders, contractors, suppliers, get wealthy. The people who actually fight get modest pay, debt, and trauma. No amount of patriotic rhetoric changes that mathematical reality. Third, conquest economies are unsustainable without functioning systems. Alexander's empire collapsed within months of his death. Not because of military defeat, his generals were still the best in the world, but because there was no systematic way to generate revenue comparable to what had been looted. The Persian treasure ran out. The administrative system was corrupt, and without Alexander's charisma holding it together, the empire fractured into warring kingdoms. Plunder can fund expansion, but it can't sustain administration. According to a 2022 study in the journal Archaeological and Anthropological Sciences, the colossal amount of wealth plundered by the Macedonians may have reached up to 200,000 talents of Attic standard, which, in modern units, correspond to a staggering silver weight of about 5,200 metric tons. 5,200 metric tons, the greatest accumulation of silver in ancient history, captured, scattered, and ultimately lost to corruption and mismanagement. There's a deeper lesson here about human nature and power. Alexander didn't conquer Persia to get rich. He was already king of Macedon. He had everything a 20-year-old could want. He conquered for glory, for immortality, to surpass his father, to become a god. The wealth was incidental, a means, not an end. He spent it as fast as he captured it because money meant nothing to him personally. What mattered was the next conquest, the next impossible march, the next legendary victory. But for everyone around him, his generals, his treasurers, his suppliers, the wealth was very much the point. They got rich while Alexander chased glory. And when he died, they spent 20 years fighting over his empire, trying to claim their share of the loot. This is the pattern of every great enterprise, military or otherwise. The visionary leader pursues something transcendent: glory, innovation, legacy. Everyone else pursues profit. The leader gets the statue, the followers get the money. Human nature hasn't changed in 2,300 years. People still confuse means and ends, still pursue wealth while claiming higher motives, still enrich themselves from systems they claim serve noble causes. Alexander captured $500 billion and died at 33. Probably poisoned by his own officers. His empire lasted less than a year after his death. His generals fought for decades over the scraps. The money didn't make him happy. It didn't make his empire stable. It didn't even make his soldiers wealthy. It just created corruption, conflict, and ultimately, collapse. Alexander's heist remains unmatched. No conqueror before or since has captured comparable wealth in such a short time. $500 billion in 11 years, from Macedonia to India. The greatest plunder in history. But the story isn't really about the money. It's about what happens when you confuse conquest with administration. When you mistake captured wealth for generated wealth. When you think military genius automatically translates to economic competence, it doesn't. Alexander proved that conclusively. You can conquer the world and still go broke. You can capture everything and still lose control. You can be history's greatest general and history's worst financial manager simultaneously. The treasure of Persia scattered across 3 continents. Harpalus stole millions. Corrupt governors embezzled more. Soldiers ended up in debt. The empire collapsed. And within a generation, most of that legendary wealth had been spent, lost, or melted down into coins that financed the wars of Alexander's successors. Nothing remains except the ruins. And the lesson. And if you think Alexander's financial mismanagement was spectacular, wait until you see what the Romans did with their military budget. That's a story of empire, inflation, and how an army that conquered the Mediterranean bankrupted itself, paying for conquests. We'll audit the legions next. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Past Chronicles has the answers. I'll show you where to look.